Hi everyone, I'm really honoured to be here, and thank you so much Todd Allen for the invitation, and Susie Hobbs-Baker. It's a real honour to be here today. So my name is Kirsty Gogan. I'm CEO of Energy for Humanity, which is a non-profit environmental organisation. I'm really excited that today we're launching our Swiss chapter. So I'm going to talk to you today about innovation from a social perspective rather than a technical perspective. But first, let me just share a really great saying that I read this morning. The pessimist complains about the wind. The optimist tries to change it. The realist adjusts the sails. So bear that in mind, and I'll just set out a quick outline of what I'm going to cover in the next 20 minutes or so. So it's a story in 3 parts. Firstly, a recap about why we care about this in the first place. Do we actually need nuclear, and if so, how much do we need, and isn't conventional nuclear good enough? Secondly, what's the infrastructure needed for nuclear R&D? Here we'll look at 3 things that we need to get this technology off the ground. And then thirdly, re-engineering the context for nuclear. It's not technical innovation, cultural innovation is needed too. Here we'll look at some examples of different types of regulation and some examples from other industries. All right, so let's kick off. Why do we care about this? Well, 1 billion people currently lack access to electricity. Nearly 3 billion people cook on stoves fueled by wood, dung, coal and charcoal. The health consequences are severe. Every year there are 2 million premature deaths from indoor air pollution, and 1 million cases of chronic lung disease, and half of all pneumonia deaths in children are caused by indoor air pollution. Now there's a perceived conflict between expanding global energy access and rapidly reducing greenhouse emissions to prevent climate change. And the solution to solving both climate change and energy access has come to mean small-scale, decentralised renewable energy technologies. Even the UN's flagship Sustainable Energy for All programme, for example, claims that basic human needs can be met with enough electricity to power a fan and a few light bulbs and a radio for 5 hours a day. So it's not surprising that not only is coal the #1 source of electrical energy, it's also the fastest growing. This is for 2 reasons. Firstly, coal is abundant and cheap. And secondly, half of the world's population lacks access to electricity, but quite rightly aspire to rich lives, not only for household use, but large-scale uses, like in industry and streetlights and schools and hospitals. Whilst renewables have a real part to play, they cannot scale sufficiently to replace coal on cost or performance. Now, we shouldn't turn our noses up. Old King Coal has served us well. Coal drove the Industrial Revolution in the West, just as is now happening in China and elsewhere. And in the UK, coal contributes 40% of our electricity mix. So in the battle between climate change and coal, coal's winning because coal promises prosperity. All the same, it's been 25 years since we first really understood that climate change would be a big problem if we didn't cut down on greenhouse gas emissions. And since that time, despite all the efforts of world leaders, scientists, civil society, we have not made a dent in the upward trajectory of emissions. Not a dent. To quote James Hansen, we are kidding ourselves if we think we're solving the climate problem with renewables. But increasingly, it does feel like that's changing. Now, this may be in part thanks to Germany's massively expensive and carbon-intensive experiment in wind and solar, the law of unintended consequences. Every credible policy-making body, scientific policy-making body, concludes that a massive expansion of nuclear energy is critical if we're serious about transitioning from fossil fuels, not only for electricity generation, but also industrial heat, desalination, transport. Okay, so what does a massive expansion mean? Well, right now we have 430 operating nuclear reactors globally, plus 70 more in the pipeline. Over the next 2 decades, it's estimated that the global market for nuclear will be worth more than $1 trillion, and a further $400 billion will be spent on decommissioning. Broadly speaking, bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, reckon we need to at least double or triple all low-carbon sources, including nuclear energy, and this maybe translates to 1,000 new nuclear reactors globally by mid-century if we're serious about stabilising carbon emissions. And bear in mind, of course, that in non-OECD countries, they'll count for more than 70% of the growth in energy demand over the next few decades. Oh, and if that's not enough, There's also a growing consensus amongst climate scientists that due to the cumulative CO2 emissions, even an 80% reduction in fossil fuels by mid-century isn't going to be enough to avert disaster. So we need to abandon fossil fuel use altogether, and it may seem impossible, but unlike current renewable technologies, nuclear energy has already proven to be highly scalable. You know, famously, France decarbonised 70% of their electric grid in just 11 years using 1970s era reactor technology. And today their electricity sector is virtually carbon-free. However, conventional nuclear will be difficult to scale globally to the extent that's needed, and that's why we need advanced, mass-producible, passively safe reactor designs. With these, there's a very real promise of safely, affordably replacing fossil fuels with clean energy within the time that we have left to solve this problem. Now, of course, we have the problem of the lack of investment in advanced energy nuclear R&D over the past 20 years, driven in no small part by the anti-nuclear agenda and political opposition. And that's meant that revolutionary advances in nuclear technology, which are based on 50 years of R&D by national labs and private companies, they've been held in check by outdated, rigid public policy. But as we're hearing in this workshop, there are emerging, potentially world-saving technologies ready to be developed and prototyped with commercial mass production possible within these timeframes, if the commitment to do so by government regulators is assured and sustained. Okay, good. So what do we need to do to make this happen? Well, three things. Firstly, facilities for private companies to build and test prototypes in a DOE supervised environment. We have a lot of licensed sites here in the US, in the UK, in Canada, where prototypes can be built with regulatory oversight to approve the safety case. Probably a fast-fail, phased testing approach would be a strong option, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, a clear regulatory pathway, ideally with staged licensing, so that prototypes can be funded in stages, built to scale, and ultimately approved for commercial use once their operational safety has been proven. And we'll come back to that too. And then finally, the third and significant driver will be that advanced nuclear technology must overcome the barriers to entry posed by the abundance and low cost of fossil fuels. In other words, cheaper than coal. Now, to achieve that, new designs will need to be not only more googly, but also simple, passively safe, using modular, mass-proven production techniques like that utilised by the commercial aircraft and shipbuilding industries. This would mean advanced nuclear plants have a chance of accessing global markets and outcompeting coal and gas, whilst also scaling rapidly. But to get there, they need to cross the valley of death from what's possible to what's actually delivered to the market at scale. Now, the current US regulatory model is wonderful for investors in mature, established technologies. It's prescriptive and predictable. Investors like predictability. What they hate is uncertainty, which is what we have now for advanced nuclear, where there isn't a clear regulatory pathway, and therefore there's a lot of uncertainty around cost and timescales. In a liberalised energy market, two things matter when building a conventional nuclear power station: capital cost and the cost of capital. Nuclear plants they're huge, and they require a very large upfront capital investment, and that makes them practically unfinanceable in the private sector. So the UK has created a really innovative energy policy framework to create certainty for investors in capital-intensive, low-carbon infrastructure through reform of its electricity market. Now, this aims to balance the needs of the market within defined goals for energy policy, and these are affordability, carbon reduction, energy security, otherwise known as the trilemma. High upfront capital investments in all low-carbon technologies are then supported by contracts agreed between the developer and governments to agree a fixed price for the electricity that's generated over a given period of time. And this creates a guaranteed rate of return for the investor, a stable price for the consumer, and then, of course, contributes to energy security and carbon reduction goals. In the UK, our new build programme has cross-party support and a strong academic support network. But it's existed in a state of total anticipation for years, waiting for Hinkley to finally get the green light on the final investment decision from the French parent company. Now, we've come a long way, but we're still not across the line. once built and operating, Hinkley will generate 7% of our total electricity, save 9 million tonnes of carbon dioxide every year for replacing gas. And for this reason, I want to see this plant built, but boy is it expensive. The last count was 24 billion, up from 16 billion last year. Why are costs rising so much? Why is it so darn expensive? Make no mistake, compared to every other form of low carbon electricity generation per megawatt hour, with the exception of onshore wind, although that doesn't take into account systems costs, even Hinkley is good value per megawatt hour. More expensive than coal and gas, but in the UK we're discounting those because we have to cut carbon emissions. The truth is that the UK has the luxury of building the world's most expensive power station. The UK has existing licensed sites, supportive local communities, a strong planning regime, world-class regulatory capability, a well-established grid that can handle enormous volumes of power, and in theory it's willing to pay to get zero carbon electricity over the lifetime of the plant, providing continuous clean electricity probably well into the next century. This upfront investment will pay off and our children's children will benefit from this eye-wateringly expensive investment. But this model is clearly not scalable to the rest of the world where such conditions don't exist. Countries that don't have existing regulatory capability, the skills and supply chains to construct or operate conventional nuclear, even a grid. Many barriers exist to globally scaling up nuclear to the extent that's needed, and broadly speaking, these hinge on concerns around safety, waste, proliferation and cost. Widespread ideological opposition to nuclear energy creates investor uncertainty, political risk, and in turn drives up cost. Now, this lack of public support erodes the political mandate, and for example, nuclear is apparently unmentionable in the State of the Union address, despite providing a full 61% of US zero carbon electricity. And so advanced nuclear energy needs to address not only the conventional arguments against nuclear, safety, waste, proliferation and cost, but also to fill the vacuum in civil society that's traditionally been an open field for anti-nuclear campaigners. This is our goal with the Energy for Humanity, to mobilise and mainstream a new, pragmatic, ambitious vision for energy led by environmental and humanitarian values, working with our friends and colleagues in academia and think tanks and civil society groups all over the world. For example, Professor Brooks' brilliant initiative to gather 66 signatures from renowned conservationists from all over the world to support nuclear is a wonderful example. It's a powerful statement for the conservation community to speak up for nuclear as a green technology. When I created the Low Carbon Alliance between renewables and nuclear industries in the UK, it was much more powerful to have a renewables representative stand on a platform and say, we need nuclear in the mix, than having a nuclear representative say, we need nuclear in the mix. So it's as much about the messenger. The messenger is as important as the message. And of course, it isn't just about electricity generation, the myriad of potential applications and exaptation. Now, I learned that word while researching for this talk. It means the way in things things can find new and unexpected uses. They're as yet unknown and tantalising. The energy-water nexus and need for widespread desalination is becoming more of an issue throughout the world as climate change, deforestation, overdevelopment have dangerously depleted existing supplies. Today, one of the world's largest cities, Sao Paulo, today is about to run out of water this year, triggering a potentially devastating social, economic, political upheaval. So my key message for you is that new technologies, they're not isolated inventions. Context is king. Understanding market drivers is critical to success. The best technology isn't necessarily the winner. The one that responds well to a market opportunity might be. I'll say it again, technologies are not isolated inventions. Any innovation exists within a constellation of interrelated technological and organisational innovations. What the hell is an innovation constellation? It's the education system, the media, the political, the regulatory system, and many other institutions all interacting with each other. And these institutions are staffed by humans. People whose behaviour and interaction shape how these institutions work. So with regulation, these social aspects, they're key. For example, With human fertility treatment, it can't be understood as a scientific development in isolation. Its use is regulated. In the UK, it was the Warnock Commission that advised on appropriate regulation, and not only was this not an exclusively scientific endeavour, on the contrary, Anne McLaren was the only scientist on the commission. So IVF, fertility treatment, involves medical science, but also the regulatory and legislative environment. This puzzles as much about human behaviour as about engineering. It means aligning with values and ethics that inform whether a society is prepared to accept a new technology and how exactly that technology will be applied. Research has shown that people are less interested in the attributes of a technology itself, and they're much more interested in the values that it represents. The success of the film Pandora's Promise was partly due to the fact that it featured unlikely champions for nuclear saying, "I share your values and I've changed my mind." So context is king, and what I'm really interested in is how do we re-engineer the socio-political context for advanced nuclear to flourish and the planet to be saved. So here's a question: why is it that most people think the safest form of electricity generation is the most dangerous? Nuclear is the safest form of electricity, by the way, against a metric of deaths per terawatt hour. Indeed, James Hansen has provided evidence that, in fact, nuclear energy has saved 1.8 million lives. Now, I don't believe people are afraid of radiation or don't understand enough science. In London, after the unfortunate spy Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210, cab drivers made a fortune running tours around the radiation trail in sushi bars and hotels and cafes all around London. People said, "I was in that cafe where traces were found," like a cool status update. British Airways published details of 221 flights of the contaminated plane affecting around 33,000 passengers. Londoners were not freaked out. Oh, there's a big topic here, you know, but part of the reason why people are afraid of nuclear is because the industry has spent years persuading them that nuclear is uniquely dangerous. Here's an example. In most countries with nuclear power, the maximum allowable dose limit for the public is 1 millisievert. Background radiation in the UK is around anything from, say, 2 millisieverts to 7. Yet there's no dose limit for coal-fired power stations, which do emit radioactive emissions, as well as mercury and lead and benzene. I believe the nuclear industry safety culture does more harm than good. To be clear, I'm not talking about the actual safety performance or its importance. I'm talking about the messages being sent and the culture that's developed. We need innovation not just in technology, but also a cultural innovation too. The industry's failed to appreciate that by being so intent on telling everyone how seriously they take safety, their reassurances have the opposite effect and leave everyone convinced that what they're doing is incredibly dangerous. A senior Sellafield worker recently joked that he suspected visitors were afraid that their feet would fall off if their socks touched the floor. Okay, maybe at Sellafield they might. No, I'm only joking. Working to a quarter of the legal limit on dose has quite the opposite effect on public confidence as what's intended. Not only that, but it's forced the regulator to continuously ratchet down standards even further at higher cost to satisfy the perception of infinite danger with negligible or even negative benefits, since it makes nuclear more difficult to build and fossil fuels more attractive. I often use the analogy of the airline industry. The glamour of the jet set era may well be over, but airlines market themselves on their service, not on their safety record. Would you think twice about flying with an airline that markets itself as so safe that its wings hardly ever fall off? Obviously, we want to be confident that the airline is properly regulated, staff are professional, highly trained, but this should be internal best practice, not an external marketing campaign. There's a difference. The success of the anti-nuclear campaigners in delaying nuclear construction while interest on borrowed construction funding kept increasing and eventually made the argument that nuclear is expensive, a self-fulfilling prophecy. The current price of Hinkley is 2 or 3 times higher than the price of building a nuclear power station in the 70s. They had made their assertion a reality. Nuclear construction is now expensive. Every possible facet of the legal system was used to hold up construction month after month, year after year, With one legal challenge after another, nuclear opponents could congratulate themselves. Yes, they had destroyed an industry. Their strategy had been a brilliant success. To what purpose? Well, fossil energy continued to dominate, with probably thousands of new fossil plants being built instead. We could have decarbonised our economy, but the environmentalists stopped it from happening. And today, many have real doubts about the ability of the nuclear industry to deliver in light of pretty shocking cost and performance schedules. Clearly, we need a new paradigm for delivery of new capacity. So what can we learn from other industries? Well, the story of environmental regulation can be summarised in, let's say, 3 or 4 sentences. So 1, no regulation. Environmental disasters. Okay. 2, fix pollution problems with prescriptive regulations often defined by bolted-on end-of-pipe solutions. 3, regulators work with companies to design new systems that mitigate environmental impact further upstream, taking into account business drivers, cost efficiencies, etc. Xerox is a classic example of this. Xerox saw the future direction of travel on disposal of waste, electric and electronic equipment. They proactively worked with the European Commission to design new legislation, and then they set the timetable for it to come into force. Meanwhile, Xerox cunningly implemented technical innovation that enabled them to immediately comply with the new rules, gaining first mover advantage against their competitors in the new regulatory environment. 4, market-based systems, designed to stimulate innovation in the private sector to achieve identified goals. Now, the UK electricity market reform is a good example of this one. Government sets parameters, affordability, carbon reduction, security of supply, and then creates the market to encourage the private sector to achieve those goals however it sees fit. Then we have the principle of fast fail. General Electric's really famous for this one. Basically, test an idea to failure as quickly as possible. An example of fast fail that I like is what Lockheed Martin appear to be doing with the fusion power research programme, rather than going for what the Europeans are doing, which is to build a giant tokamak fusion plant, which is gigantic. It will take 20 years just to build the thing. Lockheed have said, why not build a little version, scale down, test the concept, mutate it, iterate it, much, much faster by virtue of scaling it down. Now, I like this because it tries to get around the risk that the innovation just gets locked into being a science project, with endless potential for academics to just win research grants and never actually become a commercial reality. No offence, academics, we need you. For example, the pharmaceutical industry. They used to throw all this money into the R&D in the hope that one day they'd make a breakthrough that becomes a huge blockbuster and pays for the whole R&D programme. It's a bit like the music industry. Then a Radiohead comes along and pays for all the bands that never quite broke through to smash hit status. The problem is that fast fail can't work forever, which is why phased testing is really good. In some ways, Radiohead does illustrate the phased approach to testing. They started out as a total indie band, then an indie band with a fan base, and by the 3rd album, they were basically the new Pink Floyd. Now, these days, pharma has essentially de-risked R&D by outsourcing it to SMEs and startups from university spin-offs. If one of those SMEs has a breakthrough, then the multinational acquires the SME, and the process is really defined by long timescales, high cost, mitigated by stage testing, clear milestones which can help provide certainty for investors. So to solve our global challenges, we need hundreds of new ideas and hundreds of companies working on them. This isn't going to happen without government leadership in R&D. Public R&D investments in the 70s and 80s made a huge contribution to the shale gas boom that the US is enjoying today. It's the same with the iPhone. It brings together innovative technologies that were created by government funding, the touchscreen, wireless, even the internet itself. Who could have anticipated how much exaptation of the internet when it was first developed by 4 US universities? Unless decision makers buy into the level of ambition in the first place, we won't see the necessary changes fast enough. Everything's achievable. Standardization, harmonization, co-location and streamlining of regulatory processes and licensing that are needed to drive down cost and stimulate innovation. Even the executive order for a regulatory pathway is possible. Academic research and commercial development can come closer through physical co-location. In the UK, the automotive firm Jaguar Land Rover has moved its entire research facility to the campus of Warwick University to enable integration with the university's manufacturing group. The next generation nuclear community will need to work together to mobilise the constellation of innovation, to win the hearts and minds of decision makers, that these are not just perpetual motion machines or science projects, but viable technologies that can create a leadership role for America in solving global challenges. What we're selling here is hope. Promising technology is part of that, but just as important is enthusiastic support from a wide range of influencers from industry, business, media, civil society. Scientific leaders are vital to credibility, political support, and the provision of R&D facilities, and lots of talented, brilliant people. You know, maybe deep down, even Al Gore knows that we can't solve climate change with wind and solar alone. What we need is to convince the doubters that there is a viable alternative, not just in terms of technology, but also in terms of values and ethics. Now, this doesn't mean complaining about the wind or trying to change it. It means adjusting the sails to point towards a realistic and equitable level of energy access for human development, calling for a massive expansion of clean energy, primarily in the global south, in combination with rapid, ambitious acceleration of advanced nuclear innovation. Building a new framework, a new moral framework for these challenges is vital for mobilising the constellation of innovation towards a shared vision of the future. And then let's just go for the moonshot right here on our planet, because nothing is more important right now for our generation than getting this right. Thank you very much for your attention.